In this video, we're going to talk about boat hull design with Fusion 360 Forms. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to talk about something that came in as a comment on one of the other videos. I was asked about creating what are called fair surfaces that are used in boat design. Now, I will start by saying that I am not a boat designer. I have done a little bit of work helping companies reverse engineer fiberglass, handmade fiberglass hulls before, but I wasn't involved in the actual design of the hull, just reverse engineering them. So with that in mind, I do want to talk a little bit about a couple of different approaches you can take to design something like this. Now, we're going to talk about two main approaches. We're not going to completely make a boat hull, but since we are covering forms with so many different types of models, I think it's important that we understand a little bit about how to start our designs and some of the pitfalls we're going to run into. So we'll get started by creating a new form, and just like with most forms, we're going to start with a plane. Now with this first method, we're going to begin with a plane at the origin. We want to make sure that we have length symmetry, and we don't want to add too many faces here. Once we have our first sections, we want to begin by making what the hull looks like, at least the bottom of the hull from the side. So I'm going to go ahead and find my edges. I'm going to move into box display, which is Alt and 1. You can also go into your selection options and select box display here. And what we want to do is we just want to start to build out what this looks like from the side. With these back edges selected, what I'm going to do is hold down Alt, and I'm going to pull this back a little bit, remembering that we never want the transition between edges to be completely straight. Then I'm going to grab the front, hold down Alt, and extrude it once more. Next, I'm going to double click on the midline, and I'm going to simply pull this down. Now, this is not a perfect solution, and you'll notice that I'm not using the X direction, so my Y distance has gone a little bit off. I'm just going to hit 0 in that box and then hit enter. Now, this doesn't look much like a boat, and if we switch to smooth display, it's really not taking much of a shape yet, but that's okay. What we need to do is we need to start building out the hull shape. The first thing that I want to do is I want to connect this front edge. Now, there are two different ways that we can do this. We can use merge edge, or we can use weld vertices. Both will give you the exact same result. I'm going to just merge these two vertices, and because we have symmetry, it's going to automatically carry that symmetry line up for us, and we'll say OK. Now, at this point, if you try to switch back to smooth display, it will not work. Now, the reason it will not work is because we have this point here, and this point is four-sided faces on both sides, but the point is sort of floating in the middle of space. You'll also notice that the outside shape here automatically has creases on it. Now, when we try to transition from an open face or an open plane and we start to merge these edges, it's important that we go into repair body and notice that there is an error star point here. All we need to do is click on it and it gets converted and everything's fine. The next thing that we need to do is we need to start to think about the tension in these surfaces. Now, the sides are perfectly fine, but this front, because we have this point here, the front is not happy. Now, if we take a look at this in box display, everything looks okay, but because of that point, what ends up happening is we get a lot of tension in these surfaces. Now, a couple things that we can do here, we can continue to add edges and try to manipulate the shape, or we can try to turn the front into a triangle. I usually will avoid triangles. I don't think it's a good idea, but let's at least try it at this stage before we add too much detail. To do this, all we really need to do is go to weld vertices. We'll take this and we'll weld it here, and we'll say OK, and then we'll take a look at it in smooth display. So that is a much better solution up front, having these triangular faces, rather than having that vertex that's sort of hanging out in space. So even though one of the general rules that I always say is to avoid those triangles, there might be some designs that really make use of them. Now that we have the general shape, let's start to manipulate it a bit more. With that top edge selected, I'm going to go to my right side view. I'm going to reset my pivot point to the very front, and then I want to scale these edges up. And I'm going to go all the way to 0 and then left click in the canvas area. Next, I'm going to take the shape from the top Once again, I want to move my pivot point to the front, and then I'm going to scale them out a little bit. And we can also rotate them because we have symmetry across that midline. Rotating them will allow us to go out whatever the angle is that we've created and start to build out that hull shape. Now, it's not perfect yet, but this is a good starting point. Whenever we can use the pivot point and scaling edges or rotating edges, it'll really help us control the shape a bit better. But we always do need to remember some of those basic rules. We want to avoid the internal faces having no curvature or no variance between the angles. This is okay how it is now, but I do want to manipulate the shape just a little bit. I'm going to move things around just visually. I'm not too worried about making things perfect at this point. And then I want to take a look at it in Smooth Display. So once again, very basic shape, but everything is coming together. The next thing that I want to do is I want to continue to add some edges. Now, once again, I'm not a boat designer. There are a few terms that I'm going to throw around. If they're incorrect, please let me know, but I just want to make sure that we do use some of the proper terminology. Now, this is not a very specific boat. I'm not doing a kayak or a jet ski or a speedboat or ski boat or something. We're just looking at general shapes. But the center section, or the keel that goes down on the bottom, generally does have a bit more shape to it. So I'm going to get started in box display mode. I'm going to select that edge, and I want to go to Insert Edge. Remember that when we're inserting edges, Simple is going to put the edge wherever we say, and it's going to maintain a completely straight relationship between the surrounding faces. If we use Exact, we have a little bit less control over where that edge goes, and it's going to subdivide various areas along that path in order to maintain our shape. At this stage in the design, Simple is going to be fine, but we do need to be very careful on how we use it. So once again, I'm going to select everything here. I'm going to go to Modify Edit Form, and I'm going to reset my pivot point to the top. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale this down a little bit, and I'm also going to scale it so it's more vertical. And then I'm going to take a look at this in Smooth Display. So again, we're starting to make that keel section where we've got that deep V that rides in the water. Now, once again, I'm going to go back to Box Display because we do need to fix a few things before we move on. We want to make sure that the way that this transition happens up front is very natural. Everything else that happens from here back is going to be okay, but we do need to make sure we control that front and always check it in Smooth Display to make sure that things look okay. This is one of the problems with using forms for this type of design is you really need a lot of detail in certain areas, and those are going to be difficult to achieve with this type of modeling. So what I want to do is I want to carry on adding a bit more detail. I'm going to go ahead and add another edge. I'm going to double click this one. This time I'm going to insert the edge, and I'm going to use Exact so we can see what this looks like and say OK. And you can see how it divides this up. It begins to add these subdivisions here, and you'll notice it added a couple here, and it ends at a T-point. Now, T-point is going to cause us problems, but for right now, what it did was it kept the shape the same, so I'm okay with that. I want to take this edge, and once again, I want to begin to manipulate it to get my shape. Now remember that with simple insertion mode, it essentially put it completely flat between the faces, but with Exact insertion mode, it's maintaining that shape. What I want to do is, once again, reset my pivot. I'm going to put it up top. I want to scale these down a little bit. And there's something with Fusion right now. If I try to use Alt and 1 and Alt and 3, what it's going to do is it's going to put that in my dialog box. So if you need to go back and forth between box display with something selected, you need to go into your selection options and go to Smooth Display here. Or you just simply need to deselect that edge, then you can go back and forth just fine. Everything looks okay so far, but I want to take this edge, once again, put my pivot point up top, and I want to begin to scale it again horizontally to sort of pull it in a bit tighter, and then take a look. Once I'm happy with the keel shape, then I want to begin to start to work out the rest of this hull. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to carry on this T-point, and I'm going to carry it all the way back. And to do that, we'll use Insert Point. We won't be able to use the exact insertion mode for this because it's not going to let us select the end. It will only let us select along another edge for some reason. So we need to use simple. And I'm simply going to click on the red point or the midpoint of each edge going back and say OK. Now remember to go back to box display and note that these are going to be perfectly flat, so we need to move that vertex. So I'm going to start by modifying it and just pulling it down a little bit, and we'll need to do the same thing on the vertex on the back. Just pull it down to make sure that we have at least a little bit of shape. It's not perfect solution right now, but it will get us a little bit closer, so we can take a look at this in Smooth Display. So now we have a shape, but we need to add more detail. Now, generally, I would say take this into the surfacing environment and then begin to add the detail there. However, if you want to play around with trying to add detail, this is where you begin to start to work yourself into a corner. So it's important that we at least understand what happens when we try this. Before you begin to add more detail, I do think it's important that you take the time and make sure what you have so far is going to work for your shape and your design. So for example, I'm sort of moving these things around and I'm looking at the lines that we have here in box display. And the main reason I'm doing that is because when we do that in box display and we use the utilities make uniform, it's going to help normalize the distance between those edges relative to the smooth display. So if you spend the time trying to make all of these faces a roughly equal shape in box display, then when you use smooth display, it'll really help. And what I want to do is I want to move just a couple more things around just a little bit, and then I want to insert another edge. Now it's tricky at this point because we don't have that triangle that we initially started with. When it uses the exact insertion mode, you can see here that now we've got this T-point, which is essentially creating a face that has 4 sides on it. Now it looks like a T-point, but in reality, we're maintaining a 4-sided face. You might find at some point in your design that you need to turn that into a triangle. And if you do, just keep in mind that it's going to be tricky to define what happens up front. But you can see that Fusion automatically turned that into a 4-sided face for us, and the rest of them are 4-sided as well. So I'm simply going to double click this edge. I'm going to go to Insert Edge. I'm going to use the simple insertion mode and both. And I'm going to put these relatively close. Now, this is generally going to be very bad for us, but I at least want to show what happens and how we can possibly work around it. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to remember that we don't want things to be perfectly straight. When we add these on both sides, these edges are essentially collinear, and these edges are collinear as well, and that's something that we need to fix. So I'm going to double click, go to Modify Edit Form, reset my pivot point up front, and I'm going to deal with the front in just a second, but I'm going to scale these in. I'm going to do the same thing to this edge as well. Reset my pivot point, and I'm going to scale these in as well. Now before I get too far, let's take a look at this in Smooth Display. You can see that we're starting to add those chine details. Now this is really not the best way to do it, and again, I want to just word of caution there. And the main reason is because of the way that this shape is going to terminate up front. Now, this is something that generally you need to be very specific about on a hull design. This is usually going to go all the way across the front and back around the other side. And here, what's happening is it's ending in this section here. So you would really need to spend a lot of time making these edges transition across the middle. So that's what I want to focus on. I'm going to go back to box display. We're going to go to Insert Point, and I'm going to carry this point to the middle of this edge, and I'm going to carry it across. Now remember, we're using simple insertion mode here, so we need to do a little bit of work before we get too far ahead of ourselves. And I'm going to pull this up. I'm going to pull this one up as well, and maybe pull this one down a little bit. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to carry that shape across the front of the hull. I really want to pay close attention to the angles between these edges. I don't want them to be too drastically different. And remember, we're only looking at it from the side right now. We also need to make sure we look at it from the front or the top and ensure that we do have a nice gentle transition for what we're doing here. The next thing that I want to do is I want to carry this shape across. So once again, insert point. I'm going to go from here. I might want to widen the gap here or narrow it down depending on the type of transition you want. Narrowing it down will bring it more to a point. Widening it will let it sort of blend away. And then once again, we need to move these around because we want to make sure that we don't have a flat section between those edges. And I can't stress that enough. That is the killer of most of these designs that I've seen, is when you try to add too much detail, too many edges, and you end up with these flat sections. So let's take a quick look in Smooth Display, see what this looks like. I'm going to hide my edges using Control and 4. And we can see that detail goes around the front of the hull. And this right here, it's going to be kind of hard to see on the video. There's a little bit of a bump right there. That is most likely just a graphics issue and not something that I'm worried about. But now we've got sort of the layout of the shape. What we can do is we can continue to refine it. I mentioned we're not going to completely model this boat, but these are the types of details that really, again, can make or break a design. So I want to spend a little bit of time refining this. What I would likely do is I would take a couple of these edges, maybe these two, and begin to pull them back a little bit. And then maybe take these two edges and pull them in a little bit. But no matter what we do, we are transitioning through a triangle here, which is going to be a tricky transition. And it's going to take a bit of work to play around with. But you can see that we are getting something. There's a little bit of a dip there because of that triangle. So if you have that issue, you're going to have to spend some time retopologizing this to get rid of that triangle. And the main way that we would do that is we would use Insert Edge. So we're going to come down, or I'm sorry, Insert Point. And I'm just going to bring this to here to sort of make a point. And I'm going to grab these two, pull them out. And once again, this does make a completely flat section. So we want to be mindful of the curvature we're trying to achieve. You can see that it's sort of bumped out. I'm going to bring that in. And then take a look at it in Smooth Display. Control 4, hide my edges. And you can see that it created an extra little bump there that still needs to be fixed. At this point, before I tried anything else, I would try Make Uniform, see if I can relieve some of that tension there. If not, then what I might do is go back to that triangle and just kind of continue to work with the triangle. Okay, so at this point, we've done quite a bit in terms of laying out a general shape. Hopefully you start to see that it's going to take quite a while to get something like this to work. So what I want to do is I want to talk about a second potential method that I would use to start a design like this that is completely different than anything else that we've modeled. So this is the modeling approach that we would use for most designs. But now we're going to flip it on its head and try something different. So now we're going to create a sketch. I'm not going to do a complete hull again. We're just going to talk about some basic process. What I want to do is I'm going to take a spline and hit Escape, and I'm going to start to make that sort of side profile, what you would typically see on these chines as they go from the front of the boat all the way to the back or the transom. Once I have this shape, what I'm going to do is select it and use Control C and Control V to copy and paste it. And I'm just going to make another version of it. And I'm just going to work with probably 3 edges just to kind of show the process here. And now what we have is we've got 3 splines from the side that are essentially the same. They're just copied and pasted. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of these and extrude them out. I'm going to grab all 3 at the same time, and I'm just going to pull them out. You can make them symmetric and use like a midline symmetry. I'm not going to go to that level, but we're just going to talk about what we want to do with this. The first thing that I will say that the big thing that we should always worry about is the spacing should be uniform. We always want to try to have uniform spacing in our designs until we get down to the level of detail where we begin to add all of those extra edges to get creases and to get transitions of shapes. At this stage, everything should be as close to uniform as possible. So we're going to say OK, and then we want to begin trimming these. Now, we can do this a couple of different ways, But the main way that I'm going to do for this example is I'm just going to simply use insert point, and I'm going to start to trim them basically the shape of the hull. Again, we're not making an entire hull. I'm just looking at a very general process, and I'm probably going to get rid of most of this information on the back. Then I'm going to double click this outside edge and simply hit delete. So what this gives me is the hull shape on the outside relative to that spline from the side. So again, we're going to go to the top. We're going to repeat that insert point. This time it's going to be out a little bit further because as we go down, what I'm going to assume is that the boat is getting wider. In reality, it's getting smaller, but I'll show you how to deal with that in just a second. And we'll say OK. And once again, take that outside edge and just delete it. Now at this point, if you've decided that this needs to be smaller, what we can do is we can take that edge, we can go to insert edge, and we can just put another one wherever we want it, and then delete this one. So now you can see that the hull is getting smaller as we go down. So last, we want to do the same thing to this third section that we created, insert point. And once again, I'm going to follow it from the top. I'm going to kind of change the shape just a little bit, maybe make it wider or narrower. Say OK. I'm going to take this edge. Once again, I'm going to insert an edge. We're going to do single. I'm going to put it over here. And then we can delete the outside edge and delete this second edge. So at this point, what we're doing is we're essentially looking at this how you would build a ship. So essentially you would build a ship by using these sort of ribs or the skeleton structure. Now in general, that skeleton structure is running in a different orientation, but what we're doing is we're building it from a horizontal cross section and working our way down. So what I want to do at this stage is I'm going to use modify and bridge. I'm going to double click this edge for side 1. I'm going to double click this edge for side 2 and build my bridge. Now you'll notice that this is not really what we would expect to see. There's a good reason for that. I want to go into box display. So we're going to select the body. We'll select this one and go into box display. Then I'm going to take this upper edge and delete it, and take this lower edge and delete it. Then I'm going to go back to bridge. We're going to go from here to here. We can use 3 faces, and I'm going to change it to 2 just to show. And then double click this edge and delete it. Now if we take this and look at it in smooth display, what we're doing is we're building the side of the hull. Now this method takes a little bit more planning. You really need to have some references, some sketches to go by, but essentially you are going to get a smoother result than trying to manually design this hull. If we try to manually add edges and extrude edges and bring things together, what we're going to end up seeing is that it becomes pretty difficult to do. So as I start to pull this around and then maybe come down to the keel, come over, and then we can mirror this to the other side, that method of building out a good portion of the hull and then adding a couple of extra sections that are needed is going to be much easier to get that smooth final shape than it is to build it like we did originally. Like we spent a lot of time trying to build this hull and add some of those details. But if you build it from those sketches from the side and you begin to extrude them out, trim them, delete sections away, what you're going to end up with, again, is just a different way to think about designing with these form bodies. Now, as I mentioned, I don't want to go through the process to design an entire boat hull because there are so many different kinds. But if you have any questions on this process, either one that I showed, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.